June 26, 1944. Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. The airfield smelled of fuel and damp metal after morning rain. In the officers' recreation hut, a checkers game sat half-finished when Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald looked up from the board. The man at the doorway introduced himself softly, but the name didn't register at first. He repeated it once more. Calm, self-contained. Charles Lindbergh. MacDonald blinked. The same man whose solo flight across the Atlantic had become legend now stood in a combat zone 10,000 kilometers from home, wearing khaki without insignia, a civilian among soldiers. He asked to discuss P-38 operations, his tone measured, almost detached. Outside, engines turned over, and the noise of war folded around them like weather. Lindbergh's arrival made little sense. He had no military commission, no orders, no right to be there. Washington had forbidden him to serve after his public opposition to the war 3 years earlier. Yet he had come anyway, authorized only as a technical consultant for United Aircraft. On paper, he was to observe. In practice, he intended to fly. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had become the symbol of American reach in the Pacific. Twin engines, twin booms, and the range to cross oceans. But even with auxiliary tanks, the fighter's endurance limited every mission. Pilots returned with gauges near empty, the fuel reserves barely enough to circle once before landing. The Pacific was too large, the distances unforgiving. A small error in mixture or throttle meant dying over water, unseen and unrecoverable. Lindbergh understood fuel the way others understood fear. His life had been built on it. In 1927, he crossed 5,800 kilometers of ocean in a single-engine monoplane with no forward view, guided only by instinct, math, and discipline. In the decade that followed, flying commercial surveys for Pan American Airways, he had turned endurance into science, measuring the silent conversation between pressure, heat, and distance. To him, range was not a fixed number. It was a variable written in patience and precision. Now at 42, gray at the temples and quiet in movement, he carried that science into a war that no longer wanted him. His notebooks were filled with columns of figures, manifold pressure, revolutions per minute, fuel flow per gallon. He believed that the P-38's supposed limits were misread, that the engines could be coaxed into a new equilibrium if handled with care. To prove it, he would do the one thing forbidden to civilians, fly combat. That evening, as dusk settled over Hollandia and the mountains turned black against the sky, MacDonald agreed to take him up. The 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, would fly at dawn. Lindbergh would join them as Blue 3 on Major Thomas McGuire's wing. A civilian who wasn't allowed to fight was about to change how America's most advanced fighter flew its war. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was the most complex American fighter in the Pacific. Twin engines, twin tails, a central cockpit pod that looked like a bullet suspended between two spears. It could fly higher and faster than almost anything Japan had in 1943, but it carried its own prison of limits. Range, fuel, endurance. The distances over New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea demanded more than the aircraft could give. Each sortie was a calculation between risk and evaporation. Pilots launched with 1,000 gallons distributed between internal tanks and detachable drops. A mission to a target 700 miles away meant no mistakes. One turn too wide, one cloud layer too thick, and the gauges would fall to zero before the coast appeared again. Men ditched in the sea more often from fuel exhaustion than from combat. In theory, the Lightning should have been ideal. 2 Allison V-1710 engines gave redundancy, power, and range. But the twin power plants also burned fuel unevenly. Regulations ordered the mixture set to auto-rich for safety, and cruise power fixed at 2,200 RPM. At those settings, the P-38 consumed nearly 100 gallons per hour. A long mission could end with both engines running on fumes. Mechanics learned to measure returning aircraft by sound, the engines coughing dry before the wheels touched steel matting. Fifth Air Force commanders demanded longer legs, but the charts said no. Engineers blamed aerodynamics. The Pacific blamed geography. The air war stretched from Australia to the Philippines, a map of open water and volcanic islands. Fighter escort meant survival for bombers, yet few fighters could stay with them past the halfway mark. The P-38's twin engines were the only chance, but even those could not be forced beyond physics, or so the manual said. In California, Lockheed's engineers produced tables for every possible setting. They covered cockpit walls with performance charts, all designed to keep engines within safe limits. The data was accurate and cautious, the product of factory testing under peacetime conditions. War ignored those conditions. In the tropics, heat and humidity changed everything: air density, mixture burn, cooling efficiency. The same settings that worked over Burbank wasted hundreds of gallons over Biak. Pilots adapted through instinct. They learned to lean mixtures by ear, throttle by vibration, glide when they could. Still, most believed the P-38's range was fixed. Doctrine left no room for deviation. Over-square operation, low RPM combined with high manifold pressure, was forbidden. It caused detonation, the violent knock that destroyed cylinder heads. Instructors repeated the rule endlessly. Never run over square, you'll blow the engines. The phrase became a kind of superstition, repeated without question. Lindbergh had spent his career questioning what others accepted. His transatlantic flight had taught him that endurance was not luck, it was calculation. He knew that power came from pressure, not speed of rotation, and that efficiency depended on keeping combustion complete but slow. To most pilots, this was abstract theory. To him, it was geometry expressed in fuel lines and propeller pitch. He also knew isolation. His pre-war opposition to American intervention in Europe had cost him his reputation, his uniform, and his commission. Once Roosevelt's favorite pilot, he had become his political enemy. After Pearl Harbor, when he tried to volunteer, Roosevelt blocked him personally. So Lindbergh joined the war by other means. As a consultant for United Aircraft and later Chance Vought, he tested the F-4U Corsair, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and heavy bombers at Willow Run. His reports were read by generals who refused to acknowledge his name in public. In 1944, United Aircraft wanted an expert to evaluate twin-engine fighter operations in the Pacific. The assignment gave him a narrow path back into relevance. Officially, he would observe. Unofficially, he would prove a theory, that the P-38's range could be nearly doubled by managing its engines differently. He carried his own tools, stopwatch, notebook, slide rule, and a conviction that every limit printed in a manual was only an average. The Pacific offered him both laboratory and absolution. The 475th Fighter Group, called Satan's Angels, was operating from Hollandia and Nadzab, flying long-range missions against Japanese bases on the Vogelkop Peninsula. Its pilots were young, aggressive, and tired of landing on empty tanks. Their commander, Charles MacDonald, had 21 victories and a permanent squint from scanning too many horizons. To him, endurance was survival. If the civilian could teach his men to bring back more fuel, he would listen. Lindbergh's first flights were routine strikes along the New Guinea coast. He flew as Blue 3 on Major Thomas Maguire's wing. The formations crossed mountains wrapped in cloud, their propellers cutting through rain that turned silver in sunlight. Lindbergh held perfect position. After several missions, ground crews noticed something impossible. His Lightning always returned with far more fuel than the others, sometimes 50, sometimes 100 gallons more. When questioned, he explained nothing at first. He logged his fuel burn, compared it against distance, and waited until the numbers were consistent. Then he asked MacDonald for permission to brief the squadron. 2 nights later, under a palm-thatched roof lit by bare bulbs, the pilots gathered. Lindbergh stood before them, calm, sleeves rolled, notebook open. He began with the basics: mixture, RPM, manifold pressure. He told them that the P-38's engines were being run too fast and too rich. That fuel was being wasted not by distance, but by habit. He described a new method: reduce propeller speed to 1,600 RPM, raise manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury, and set the mixture to auto lean. Maintain 185 miles per hour indicated. The result? 70 gallons per hour total consumption, nearly 30% less than standard. The room went silent. They had been taught that such settings would destroy the engines. Lindbergh's calm delivery made disbelief feel impolite. He reminded them that he had already flown combat at those settings. His aircraft had returned untouched. If they tried it, they would see. At first they didn't believe, then they tested. Short, local flights, cautious throttle movement, hands hovering near the mixture levers. The gauges held steady. Cylinder head temperatures ran cooler, not hotter. Oil pressure normal. Each mission stretched farther. Each landing came with more fuel left in the tanks. Skepticism gave way to curiosity. Curiosity to conversion. Within 2 weeks, the 475th was flying deeper into enemy territory than any American fighter group had ever dared. Range tables were rewritten, mission profiles recalculated. Lindbergh's method had turned a limitation into a weapon. By midsummer, his numbers were spreading through 5th Air Force squadrons from Biak to Morotai. The manual still forbade over-square operation, but the pilots no longer cared. The evidence was written on their gauges and confirmed by every safe landing. The Pacific's geography hadn't changed. Its distances remained the same. But the mathematics of flight had shifted, quietly, irrevocably, because one civilian decided that the rules were wrong. Charles Augustus. Lindbergh looked nothing like the legends painted of him. At 42, he carried the wear of distance more than the mark of fame. His hair had gone steel gray at the temples. His voice was even, almost scientific, stripped of any effort to convince. The pilots of the 475th called him Mr. Lindbergh, not Colonel or Captain. The title suited him better. He slept in the same tents, ate the same field rations, and spent his nights hunched over notebooks filled with columns of figures, engine revolutions, fuel flow, airspeed, temperature. He rarely spoke of the past, never mentioned Paris, and ignored the politics that had exiled him from uniform. He was an engineer by instinct, a pilot by necessity, and a perfectionist by faith. Everything he did began with measurement. The younger pilots studied him at first with skepticism. He was older than their fathers, a civilian, and famous for reasons that had nothing to do with war. Many believed he had come to chase nostalgia, to feel relevance again among men half his age. It took one flight to change that. On his first combat mission, flying as Blue 3 on Major Thomas McGuire's wing, Lindbergh stayed locked in formation for 6 hours. Through rain, turbulence, and anti-aircraft bursts, he never drifted a meter. McGuire landed and told MacDonald, "The old man's no passenger. He flies as clean as anyone I've ever seen." Respect followed quickly, the kind that isn't spoken but shown through silence. Lindbergh kept his distance from authority. He spent more time with ground crews than with officers. Mechanics noticed how he listened, to the tone of an idling engine, to the hiss of a carburetor line. He could hear imbalance where others needed gauges. At night, he often walked along the parked lightnings, touching wingtips as if feeling their temperature through the skin. To him, machines were alive only when understood. He had always lived between worlds. Before the war, he had traveled routes that didn't yet exist, charting courses across the Atlantic for Pan American Airways, mapping the Pacific with a compass and watch. His notes from those flights read like equations written in wind. Power 1600 RPM, manifold 29, lean mixture, efficiency peak at 180 pkg. When the rest of the world raced toward speed, Lindbergh sought balance. In the 1930s, he had visited Germany, studied its advances in aviation, and returned warning that air power would define the next war. His neutrality speech in 1941 destroyed his public standing, but not his precision. The same discipline that had made him a pariah now made him indispensable. At Hollandia, he became both teacher and experiment. He flew with every squadron, sometimes leading missions, sometimes shadowing rookies who barely recognized him. He took notes mid-flight, scribbling figures on the edge of his kneeboard while tracers flashed below. He landed quietly, climbed from the cockpit, and went straight to the operations tent to record results. McDonald called him the calmest man I ever saw in a cockpit. McGuire said he doesn't fight the airplane. He listens to it. Lindbergh explained his methods not as revelation, but as logic. He spoke of pressure ratios, cylinder temperature, propeller pitch, fuel vaporization, topics few combat pilots had ever heard outside of maintenance briefings. He reduced flight to mathematics and then rebuilt it into instinct. Once the men understood that his rules worked, their confidence hardened into faith. His demeanor never changed. After one mission, where flak burst so close it dented his wing, he stepped from the cockpit, brushed the dirt from his sleeve, and noted the time and fuel remaining before anyone could speak. When asked if he had been afraid, he said only, "Fear's an inefficient use of energy." He was the least military man in a military world, and yet the system bent around him. Officially, he was a civilian contractor, under Navy jurisdiction, on temporary assignment to 5th Air Force. In reality, he became part of the 475th's rhythm: briefings, takeoffs, debriefings, jokes, silences. He never asked to lead, yet pilots began forming on his wing when weather turned bad. He wrote in his journal that month, "Combat doesn't erase fear, it organizes it. I fly to find the place where calculation ends and trust begins." His notebooks filled with the same data every night, each entry dated, each column precise. Later historians would read them as science. To Lindbergh, they were scripture, proof that truth could be measured in gallons and minutes, not belief. He didn't come to seek redemption. He came to prove that skill was a form of service. Every mission flown, every gallon saved, every aircraft that returned with fuel left in its tanks was its own quiet absolution. By the time July began, the pilots of the 475th no longer called him the civilian. They called him one of us. At Hollandia, the P-38's flight line looked like a factory floor transplanted into jungle. Rows of twin-boom fighters sat in the glare, each one a mirror of polished aluminum and heat-warped steel. Mechanics moved among them carrying wrenches, logbooks, and tins of aviation fuel that smelled of benzene and salt. Lindbergh fit into that rhythm as if he had always belonged there. He arrived before dawn, notebook under his arm, always the same ritual. Check fuel loads, check weather, then climb into the cockpit and sit for a long moment with the engines off, reading the dials. The other pilots learned to wait. He wasn't praying, he was listening. He treated each gauge as a question that could be answered only by flying. The data began with short flights, 20-minute loops over the coast to measure fuel flow at fixed manifold pressure, while on 600 revolutions per minute, 30 inches of mercury, altitude 10,000 feet, mixture on autolean, every note written in pencil. He compared the results to the standard cruise settings used by the 5th Air Force, 2,200 RPM, at auto-rich mixture, and found a difference so large it bordered on absurd. At his settings, the engines consumed barely 70 gallons per hour total. The manuals predicted more than 100. He repeated the test under combat load, 2 drop tanks, ammunition, and full fuel. The numbers held. Cylinder head temperatures ran cooler by 15 degrees Celsius. Oil pressure stayed within limits. There was no detonation, no stress fracture, no change in engine tone except a deeper, slower rhythm. The technique went against everything the manuals warned. Never run over square, instructors had said for years. It was dogma born from early engine failures, passed from class to class like folklore. Lindbergh was rewriting that faith with numbers. He knew why it worked. Lower RPM meant fewer combustion cycles per minute. Slightly higher manifold pressure, balanced torque, without increasing total power. The lean mixture delivered complete burn with minimal waste. The result was the same thrust with less fuel and less heat. When he showed his figures to McDonald, the colonel stared for a moment, then said, "We'll try it on a milk run." The next morning, 4 P-38s took off on a routine reconnaissance to the Vogelkop Peninsula. Each pilot flew one leg using standard settings and one leg using Lindbergh's technique. They landed 6 hours later. Ground crews measured the remaining fuel. The results were precise and indisputable. The aircraft flown under Lindbergh's parameters had enough left for another full hour in the air. The reaction spread through the camp like a rumor that refused to die. Mechanics checked spark plugs expecting damage and found none. Pilots compared logbooks and recalculated radius charts by flashlight. Within a week, the 475th's mission planners began extending operational range by increments of 20 miles, then 50, then 100. The results never varied. Lindbergh continued testing. He flew armed patrols over Biak, strafing barges and airfield, recording fuel flow every 15 minutes. He watched the gauges with detached fascination even under fire. On July 1st, he returned from a 6.5-hour sortie with 210 gallons remaining when others landed near empty. No speech or explanation followed. The evidence was enough. The technical transformation was simple but profound. At standard cruise, the P-38J could reach targets roughly 870 miles from base. With Lindbergh's settings, the effective radius stretched to 750, sometimes 800. Pilots could fight over the target and still return with reserve fuel. Missions, once considered suicidal, became routine. Lindbergh described it to the group one evening as teaching the engines to breathe slowly. His words were spare, but the meaning clear. Efficiency was not caution. It was power extended through restraint. The change reached beyond Hollandia. Word spread through the 5th Air Force in coded telegrams and pilot gossip. Squadrons at Natsab, Morotai, and Oe began experimenting, each adjusting manifold pressure or mixture slightly for local conditions. Reports came back identical. Lower consumption, cooler engines, longer range. The doctrine of over-square flight quietly entered official use without authorization. By late July, maintenance officers began rewriting performance charts. One mechanic taped a handwritten note to a hangar wall. 1630. Trust it. Headquarters noticed the difference through statistics alone. Fewer forced landings, fewer lost aircraft, higher mission time. When General George Kenney's staff asked how the 475th was achieving longer range, McDonald simply replied, "Civilian mathematics." Lindbergh kept flying. On July 28th, he joined a 4-ship patrol near El Puti Bay and scored a kill against a Japanese reconnaissance plane, though it would never be officially recorded. For him, The data mattered more than the victory. His notebooks that night included only 2 lines: 6-hour mission, fuel remaining 205 gallons. The test had become transformation. Numbers written in pencil in a tropical tent had redefined what American fighters could reach. The Pacific no longer looked endless. Targets once considered unreachable now fell within an afternoon's flight. At the end of July, the 475th flew a 950-mile round trip to strike Japanese airfields at Siram. Every aircraft returned. The crews disembarked, stiff, salt-streaked, and astonished to still be alive. Their gauges showed fuel left in both main tanks. The limits of the P-38 had not changed. Only its understanding had. By July 1944, the Pacific maps hanging in 5th Air Force operations tents began to change color. Red pins that once marked the outer limits of Lightning missions moved steadily north. Hollandia to Biak, Biak to Nomfor, Nomfor to Mindanao. The arcs drawn in grease pencil stretched farther each week, like ripples expanding from a single calculation made in the cockpit of a P-38. The first missions to prove Lindbergh's method were short, cautious, and local. By mid-July, they were reaching places that had never seen American fighters before. The 475th Fighter Group's Lightnings began operating beyond the theoretical radius printed in every manual. The new pattern was methodical, fuel by fuel, hour by hour. July 1st, a 6.5-hour armed reconnaissance along the western coast of Gilving Bay. Lindbergh's P-38 landed with more than 200 gallons still in its tanks. No one else did. The figures spread faster than any order could. July 3rd, a mixed escort and strafing mission to Jeffman Island. 2 pilots turned home early on near-empty tanks. Lindbergh continued hunting barges for another hour before returning with fuel to spare. His aircraft's gauges read a quarter full when the others were dry. McDonald watched him taxi in and nodded to the crew chief. The math was real. July 5th, a full group briefing. The entire 475th adopted the new settings: 1,600 RPM, 30 inches of manifold pressure, auto-lean mixture, 185 mph cruise. The flight paths expanded again. Hollandia to Manokwari, 1,500 kilometers round trip. No losses, fuel remaining, sufficient. From then on, the P-38s of Satan's Angels flew as if the geography of the Pacific had shrunk around them. Each sortie confirmed what the numbers promised. Over the Bismarck Sea, they swept low across convoys. Over Morotai, they escorted B-25s past Japanese interceptors who never expected fighters that far from land. The transformation wasn't just distance. It was tempo. What had once been a 2-day mission with refueling stops became a single, continuous flight. The old rhythm, launch, fight, crawl back, was replaced by an unbroken circuit of speed and reach. Ground crews repainted the fuel charts on briefing boards. The word limit disappeared from the columns. On July 28th came the proof that sealed the legend. 4 Lightnings of blue flight, including Lindbergh and McDonnell, met 2 Japanese Ki-51 Sonya light bombers near El Piti Bay. The engagement lasted 30 minutes across cloud and sea spray. When the smoke cleared, one Sonya lay burning on the water. Lindbergh's burst had crippled its engine before the dive. He said nothing when they landed. But the crew chief found 205 gallons still aboard his aircraft. The others had barely 50. 3 days later, Lindbergh flew his last and most dangerous test. A fighter swept toward the Palau Islands, nearly 1,500 kilometers over open ocean. He encountered a 0 in a tight turning fight and nearly died before McDonald's warning saved him. The radio call, "Break right," came an instant before tracers passed through the space where his canopy had been. It was the closest the civilian ever came to not returning. When he landed, command decided his work was complete. The experiment had succeeded. The 475th's combat radius had grown by more than 300 miles. Through the summer and fall of 1944, the results spread across the theater. P-38s from Morotai began striking Celebes, Halmahera, and even targets approaching the Philippines. At Leyte Gulf, they escorted bombers from airfields once considered too distant. Japanese interceptors climbed too late, expecting to meet heavy bombers, not fast twin-engine fighters that now had the legs to reach them. Each flight marked a boundary crossed, not just of distance, but of belief. In operations rooms from Hollandia to Tacloban, red lines on maps kept stretching, quiet evidence that one man's arithmetic had redrawn the Pacific. The island war was no longer defined by how far aircraft could fly. It was defined by how precisely they could be flown. The Pacific Air War had entered its final transformation. Japan's convoys, once protected by range and distance, were now hunted across the open sea. The P-38 Lightning, once limited by its thirst, had become the long arm of the 5th Air Force. On that morning, 30 Lightnings from the 475th Fighter Group lifted from the steel runway at San Jose Mindoro. Their tanks were full, their engines idling at the same low rhythm Lindbergh had taught, 600 revolutions per minute. Steady, economical. Major Thomas Maguire led the formation. Below them, sunlight cut across the Gulf in metallic bands, the water shining like mercury. Each Lightning carried 2 bombs under its wings and a heart of aluminum discipline. At 09:20 hours, ground radar reported Japanese aircraft inbound from the north. Ki-84, Franks, fast, well-armed, escorting torpedo bombers toward the invasion fleet. Maguire's calm order went out on the radio. Blue flight, drop tanks, dive in pairs. They rolled inverted and fell together. The altimeters spun. Airspeed needles passed 700 km/h, then 800. In the older days, that speed would have been a death sentence. But with Lindbergh's techniques, the engines hummed in balance. The mixture leaned, the propellers cut through clean air, and the Lightning held true. Maguire came out of the dive firing. His cannon shells struck a Ki-84 from head-on, the Japanese fighter exploding into fragments that glinted like falling glass. Below him, Captain Jack Ilfrey pushed his aircraft through a dive that would once have torn the engines apart. He pulled up at 300 meters, guns firing. One torpedo bomber broke apart in spray. In 3 minutes of measured chaos, the formation shredded the convoy. 15 enemy aircraft fell, 3 ships burned, and every American fighter came home. For the first time in the Pacific War, distance and endurance no longer constrained victory. When they landed, MacDonald said nothing. He walked the line, touching each engine cowling as the heat lifted off the metal. The air smelled of cordite and oil. The men stood by their planes, quiet. The fatigue behind their eyes replaced by something sharper, trust. They no longer calculated survival by fuel gauges. They calculated it by knowledge. That engagement marked the moment the Lightning ceased being a question and became an answer. What had begun as a civilian's uninvited experiment had turned into doctrine written in fire. From that day on, every operational group across the Pacific adopted the same approach. Reduced RPM, precise mixture control, and patience as a weapon. The Japanese noticed. Intercept reports began describing American fighters that appeared deep behind front lines, seemingly immune to fuel limits. One pilot wrote, "They fall from the clouds and climb away faster than we can turn." Others called them ghosts with twin tails. Maguire, whose precision mirrored Lindbergh's, pushed the machine harder than anyone. His missions grew longer, his maneuvers tighter, his victories faster. In 6 weeks, he became the second highest scoring American ace of the war. On January 11, 1945, he tried one maneuver too many. Pursuing a Ki-43 near Los Negros, his Lightning stalled and rolled inverted. It struck the ground in an explosion of dust and flame. He had flown the same engines that had saved so many others. Even mastery could not remove mortality. News of his death reached the base at dusk. The men said little. They continued their work as always, refueling, rearming, checking pressures and mixtures. The rhythm never stopped. The war didn't allow for pause. But the silence that evening carried weight. It was the understanding that even the best precision ends in fragility. The P-38's transformation was complete. What had started as an aircraft, criticized for its range and complexity, now stood as the most capable long-range fighter in the Pacific. It could dive faster than the air would allow, fly farther than planners predicted, and strike beyond reach of its enemies. The change had come not through invention or power, but through understanding, one man teaching others to listen differently to their machines. The war slowed only at night. At Tacloban, the airfield lights burned low under blackout rules, the smell of burned gasoline and salt air mixing with jungle mist. The P-38 sat in lines, still ticking from the heat of the day's sorties. The pilots of the 475th moved through the narrow aisles between wings, their voices low, their steps automatic. It was the hour when engines cooled and men remembered how tired they were. Lindbergh sat alone near the operations tent, a cup of coffee untouched beside his logbook. The pages were filled with numbers, fuel remaining, manifold pressure, engine temperature, columns of precision drawn against the chaos around him. He had stopped writing reports. The records were enough. He knew the work had spread beyond him now. The younger pilots watched him from a distance. To them, he was part myth, part mechanic, a man who talked to engines more than to people. They called him the professor. He never corrected them. When they joked that he was trying to make a P-38 run on air, he just smiled and said, "That's the idea." He had changed their world more than any speech could have. Missions that once meant 7 hours of endurance and the certainty of landing with dry tanks had become 8, sometimes 9, with a margin to spare. They began to trust the sound of their engines instead of the ticking of the fuel gauge. Confidence replaced dread. Captain Everett MacDonald wrote in his log that month, "The cockpit feels larger now. You don't count miles, you count minutes. The fear comes later, after landing, when you realize how far you went." For many of them, fear never disappeared. It only moved aside for calculation. They still flew into storms of tracers and flak bursts, still lost friends to accidents, but the steady voice of method had entered their language. After each mission, they compared fuel data before they compared kills. Lindbergh's own log stayed clinical. He recorded no emotion, only results. But others noticed the small rituals. He touched the nose of his Lightning before every takeoff. He always removed his gloves before writing in his book, no matter how hot the tarmac. When a ground crewman once asked if he ever got used to being shot at, Lindbergh replied, "You get used to staying alive." Letters home captured what the numbers could not. Lieutenant Harold Lane wrote to his wife, "We fly with a civilian who shows us how to stretch fuel the way a preacher stretches faith. He talks quiet, but every word keeps you alive." Those who had doubted him the most now quoted him without irony. In flight briefings, they repeated his phrases. "Keep the RPM low. Don't fight the machine. Make the air do the work." The lessons spread from squadron to squadron, a chain of invisible gratitude carried by pilots who would never meet him. After the loss of McGuire, the camp moved in silence. Lindbergh didn't attend the service. He was in the hangar, leaning over a fuel pump with the crew chief. When asked later why, he said, "He already knew what we were doing this for." The statement was neither pride nor sorrow, just the efficiency of grief. The war was turning, but the men were changing faster than the front lines. They had learned something deeper than range or technique. They had learned precision as a form of faith. When the squadrons finally left New Guinea for the Philippines, the engines started in the same rhythm Lindbergh had taught. The low, patient pulse of Tao's 600 revolutions per minute filled the airfield and rolled across the sea. By then, no one thought of it as his method anymore. It was simply how the Lightning flew. By the spring of 1945, the sound of the Lightning's twin engines had become the rhythm of the Pacific. They rose from coral airstrips at dawn, droned across endless water, and returned at dusk with tanks still holding fuel. The once impossible distances, Biak, Mindoro, Luzon, were now routine. In the operations records, the change looked like a line of numbers. In 1943, one Lightning was lost for every 180 combat hours. By 1945, the rate was 1 per 2,900. Fuel starvation no longer appeared in loss reports. Pilots stopped talking about how far they could fly. They just flew. The higher command noticed, though not at first. Range figures began appearing in mission summaries that exceeded official specifications by hundreds of kilometers. Squadron intelligence officers filed notes to 5th Air Force headquarters, trying to explain the math. Eventually, the reports converged on a single name: Charles A. Lindbergh, Civilian Technical Representative, United Aircraft Corporation. By then, he was already gone. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh had left Hollandia under quiet orders to return home. He had flown 50 combat missions, mostly as Blue 3 in the 475th Fighter Group. He had survived a head-on attack, trained dozens of pilots, and proven his theories under fire. The men came out to the strip that morning to see him off. No speeches, just handshakes and the low cough of engines warming in the heat. When he lifted off and banked east, the sun flashed across his canopy like a closing arc. The pilots went back to war, and his numbers went with them. By October, new cruise tables for the P-38 appeared in official manuals. The forbidden settings, low RPM, high manifold pressure, were now listed as recommended long-range configuration. Training pamphlets explained lean of peak mixture operation using his exact figures. None mentioned his name. They didn't need to. Every pilot already knew where the knowledge had come from. In the Philippines, the extended range changed the tempo of operations. Fighters could now escort bombers to Manila, Formosa, even the coast of China. Missions that had once required leapfrogging airfields were flown directly. Air superiority spread ahead of ground forces like a shadow moving faster than invasion itself. For Lindbergh, the war ended without ceremony. He returned to the United States as quietly as he had left it. Washington offered no honors, no reinstatement of his commission. The Roosevelt administration still considered him politically untouchable. He resumed technical consulting, advising on engine performance and aircraft efficiency, as if the Pacific had been another laboratory test. The men who flew with him didn't forget. In post-war interviews, they spoke of him not as a celebrity, but as a colleague. He flew like a man who already knew the answers, McDonald said later. We just hadn't learned the questions yet. At Lockheed and United Aircraft, engineers pored over the field reports from 5th Air Force. The data confirmed everything Lindbergh had claimed. 31% increase in combat radius, lower engine wear, cooler operating temperatures. The findings fed directly into post-war engine development and the first generation of jet performance studies. When the war in the Pacific ended, most of the Lightnings were pushed off to storage yards in the desert, their aluminum fading to dull gray under the sun. They had outlived their purpose, but not their legacy. Every later aircraft that sought range through efficiency, every jet that managed thrust through discipline rather than brute power, carried an echo of the lesson he had taught. He came to the war as a civilian, banned from uniform, and left it having redrawn the boundaries of flight. The official records called it a technical adjustment. The pilots who survived knew it was something else, a correction in understanding that kept them alive long enough to see peace again. After the war, the lightning disappeared from the sky almost as quickly as it had conquered it. The long rows of P-38s that once glimmered on Pacific airstrips now sat in storage depots under desert sunlight, their aluminum fading to a quiet gray. Mechanics stripped engines for spare parts. The war's urgency drained away, but the knowledge it produced stayed behind, written in notebooks, fuel charts, and memory. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, soon to become NASA, received boxes of flight data from 5th Air Force units. The papers were dry, filled with columns of figures: RPM, manifold pressure, fuel consumption, altitude. But inside them lay the first clear map of how air behaved under pressure at scale. Engineers studying those sheets would later apply the same principles to jet aircraft. Balance before force, precision before speed. Lindbergh never spoke publicly about what he had done in the Pacific. He returned to testing, working for Lockheed and Convair, evaluating prototypes that carried his ideas forward without his name. He helped refine cruise performance in the B-36, advised on long-range profiles for the P-80 Shooting Star, and observed the early development of jet engines that would operate beyond the limits he had once measured by hand. He saw the world move past pistons and propellers, yet his influence lived in every efficiency curve that defined the new age. For the pilots who had flown under his guidance, his presence remained tangible. At reunions years later, they spoke less about combat and more about method, the way he taught them to think in ratios instead of instincts, to measure confidence in gallons rather than medals. Many admitted they had not understood his significance until long after the war ended. He had shown them that mastery wasn't bravado, it was economy. The story of the Lightning became a footnote in official histories, a brief acknowledgement of range extension techniques developed in the field. Yet those techniques changed the rhythm of aerial warfare. They transformed efficiency from a maintenance concern into a weapon. They taught an Air Force that power without understanding was waste, and that a machine's limits were rarely where its designers believed them to be. Charles Lindbergh died in 1974, far from any airfield, in a small house overlooking the Pacific. His grave was marked by a single verse from the Psalms: "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." It was the same ocean he had once crossed alone, the same expanse he had later measured by mathematics and endurance. The war remembered him quietly. The pilots of the 475th remembered him more personally. For them, every long flight that ended safely, every impossible return from distance, carried a trace of his voice in their head. Listen to the engine. Trust the air. Make it last. What he taught them went beyond range. It became a doctrine of restraint, the idea that precision is power and that control, once understood, can outlast any war.